Thinking about selling your home in Alamo Heights, or even if your home is already on the market and you're starting to wonder why the process feels slower than expected, one of the most important things to understand right now is that the market has shifted in a way that isn't always obvious at first. Because what we're seeing across San Antonio is really not a lack of activity, it's a change in how buyers are behaving and how long they're taking to make the decisions. And according to recent reporting from the San Antonio report, homes across San Antonio are spending about 20% longer on the market compared to last year, and with an average around 102 days before going under contract. And at the same time, prices have dropped significantly, which creates a very specific type of environment where homes are not necessarily losing value, but they're taking longer to sell. And that combination can feel confusing for sellers because it's not as simple as saying the market is up or down. It's more nuanced than that. And what that means for you as a seller is that if your home is taking longer to sell, it's not automatically a sign that something's wrong. It's often a sign that the way the home is positioned needs to be more closely aligned with how buyers are making decisions in today's market. And that's exactly what I want to walk you through, because when you understand the reasons behind why some homes take longer, you can approach the process with a lot more clarity and a lot more control. And the first thing you need to understand is that homes tend to take longer to sell when there is a gap between seller expectations and buyer behavior. And this is something we're seeing more clearly right now because many sellers are still anchored to pricing and market conditions from the past few years. And while buyers are making decisions based on current interest rates and current monthly payments and overall financial comfort. And according to that same San Antonio data, there are segments of the market that are performing very differently from one another. Higher price point homes are still seeing a strong demand, while more price-sensitive buyers are becoming more cautious, which means that even within the same general area, two homes can have very different experiences depending on how they are positioned. And what that creates is a situation where sellers may feel like their pricing is reasonable based on past sales, but buyers are evaluating that same price through a different lens. And when there's even a small gap between those two perspectives, it can lead to hesitation. And the hesitation is what slows down the momentum, not because buyers are rejecting the home, but because they are not fully confident in how it fits with their options. And that leads directly into the second thing you need to understand, which is that most homes take longer to sell that are not rejected outright. They are simply passed over in favor of something that feels easier to act on. And this is really one of the most important shifts in mindset because sellers often expect feedback to come in the form of objections or negotiations. But in reality, what happens most of the time is really much quieter than that. Buyers scroll, they compare, and they move on, and they gravitate towards homes that feel immediately clear in terms of value, condition, and overall presentation. And this is reinforced by a broader housing pattern we're seeing, where listings that are even slightly out of alignment tend to accumulate days on market rather than generate direct pushback. And as highlighted in a recent housing analysis, homes that linger are often not suffering from one major flaw, but from a combination of small factors that compound over time, whether that's pricing just slightly above where buyers expect it to be, presentation that doesn't fully showcase the home, or condition details that raise small questions. What happens is that buyers don't engage deeply enough to provide clear feedback. They simply move on to the next option, and that lack of engagement can feel confusing because it doesn't point to a single issue. It just feels like the home is not gaining traction. And that leads directly into the third thing you need to understand, which is that the first impression, and specifically the first 2 weeks on the market, carry more weight than most sellers realize, because this is when your home receives the highest level of attention from the most active buyers. This is also when buyers are forming their initial perception, not just of the home itself, but how it fits within the current market. And according to market behavior patterns, if a home does not generate strong engagement early, it can begin to accumulate what we call days on market pressure, where the length of time the home has been listed starts to influence how future buyers perceive it. And this is not necessarily because something has changed about the home, but because buyers are aware of how long it's been available, and they begin to wonder why. And as noted in a broader market analysis, once a home begins to sit, that time on the market creates subtle shift in perception. And that makes each additional week more impactful than the last. And this is why the early phase of listing is so important. Not because you have just one chance, but because that initial positioning sets the tone for how the home will be interpreted going forward. And when pricing, presentation, and overall positioning are aligned from the beginning, you tend to see stronger engagement, more consistent showings, and a smoother path to an offer. But when there's even a small amount of hesitation early on, that hesitation can carry forward and influence how future buyers respond. And when you step back and look at these first 3 points together, you start to see a very clear pattern. Homes don't usually take longer to sell because of one obvious issue. They take longer to sell because of small gaps in alignment between how the house is positioned and how buyers are thinking. And once you understand that, the process becomes much more manageable because those gaps can be identified and adjusted with the right strategy. Once you understand that homes taking longer to sell is typically the result of small gaps in alignment rather than one major issue, and that buyers are often quietly moving on rather than actively rejecting the property, that the first impression carries more weight than most sellers expect. Fourth thing you need to understand is that pricing, even when it feels reasonable, can still create hesitation if it does not match how buyers are evaluating the home in the current moment. And this is one of the most important dynamics we're seeing in the San Antonio market right now, because according to reporting from the San Antonio report that we created, sellers have not really been in a rush to lower prices as homes are taking longer to sell. And that creates a very specific environment where pricing is not necessarily falling, but buyers are becoming more selective. And what that means in practice is that even a small difference between what a seller expects and what a buyer is comfortable with can slow the process significantly. This doesn't mean the home is overpriced in an obvious way. It means the home is positioned just slightly outside of where buyers feel confident moving forward. And when that happens, buyers don't typically negotiate that gap immediately. They pause. They continue looking, and they compare and start looking at other options. As highlighted in the housing analysis, even a modest difference in pricing, sometimes as little as 5 to 10%, can lead to a home sitting longer and eventually requiring adjustments that may not have been necessary if the initial positioning had been more closely aligned. And this is where pricing becomes less about being right on paper and more about being understood in context. Because buyers are not evaluating your home in isolation. They're evaluating it alongside everything else they've seen. And that leads directly to the fifth thing that you need to understand, which is that condition signals, even small ones, how much a larger impact the buyer perception. The condition is more about the buyer perception than most sellers realize. In neighborhoods like Alamo Heights and Olmos Park, where many homes have character, history, and unique features, buyers are not expecting perfection, but they are paying close attention to patterns. And as noted in the same housing analysis that we looked at, if it's often not one major issue that causes hesitation, it's a collection of smaller ones that create uncertainty. Things like, deferred maintenance, old systems, visible wear, and when viewed all together, that leads the buyer to ask some important questions, which is, what else might need attention? And once that question is introduced, it can influence not only whether the buyer makes an offer, but also how they approach negotiations, financing, and really the overall confidence in the transaction. This is where many sellers unintentionally underestimate the impact of preparation, because even when the home has strong features, those smaller condition signals can shift the focus away from what's working towards what feels uncertain. And in some cases, that can limit the buyer pool, especially if certain conditions affect financing options or require additional investment after the purchase. And that leads directly to the sixth thing you need to understand, which is that presentation, especially online, plays a much larger role in how quickly a home sells than it did in the past. And this is where the process has changed significantly over the past several years, because today nearly all buyers begin their search online, and their first impression of your home is formed within seconds of photos. They look at the layout, they see how clearly the property is presented, and they look at things like homes with a weak online presence, dark photos, unclear room definitions, limited visual information, and they tend to say, hold off, and those houses get fewer showings. And that reduced activity can create a ripple effect, because fewer showings mean fewer opportunities for buyers to engage, which in turn slows momentum. And what's important to understand is this does not necessarily reflect in the quality of the home itself. It reflects how effectively the home is being communicated to the market. And in a place like San Antonio, where buyers have options and are comparing properties carefully, clarity and presentation becomes a major advantage, because when a home is easy to understand online, buyers are more likely to take the next step. And when they don't, it often means the presentation is not fully supporting the home's potential. And when you step back and you look at these things together, pricing alignment, condition signals, and presentation clarity, you begin to see how they work together to influence buyer behavior, and how even small gaps in any one of these areas can compound over time to create a slower overall experience. Well, what we see is it's not that the home isn't desirable, it's because it's got something in the way that's making it slightly harder for buyers to move forward with confidence. And once we understand and explain to our sellers how alignment, buyer behavior, early momentum, pricing, condition, and presentation all work together to influence how quickly home sells, then sellers respond. The seventh and final thing you need to understand is that time on the market itself begins to shape perception in ways that can either slow or accelerate the process, depending on how it's managed. This is where everything we've talked about starts to compound, because once a home has been on the market for a period of time, buyers are not just evaluating the home itself. They're also evaluating its history. How long has it been available? How does it compare to other properties they've seen? And what that might mean about its overall positioning. And this is not about judgment, it's about interpretation, because buyers are trying to make sense of what they're seeing. And when a home has been on the market longer than expected, well, it naturally introduces questions. Not necessarily negative ones, but questions about how the home fits within the broader market. As highlighted in the housing analysis we did, once a property begins to accumulate days on market, each additional week can subtly reinforce buyer hesitation, not because the home has changed, but becomes perception around it. And this is where timing and strategy intersect, because the goal is not simply to wait for the right buyer, it's to ensure that the home continues to be positioned in a way that invites engagement rather than hesitation. And this is also where the broader San Antonio market context becomes important, because when we looked at the San Antonio report that we ran, homes are taking longer to sell overall, with average days on market increasing. But at the same time, sellers are not really significantly reducing prices. And that creates a market where patience exists on both sides. Buyers are taking more time, and sellers are not necessarily feeling the pressure to adjust quickly. And what that means is that homes remain aligned, that with buyer expectations, well, they continue to move, while those that fall slightly outside of that alignment, they begin to sit. And over time, that sitting becomes part of the story of the home. And this is where many sellers start to feel uncertainty, because it's not always clear what needs to be done or what to change or if there's anything wrong at all. And the key here is to understand that time on the market is not just a result, it's also a signal. It's telling you how the home is being experienced in real time. And if you interpret that signal correctly, you can make adjustments that shift the trajectory. And when you step back and you look at all these 7 points together, you begin to see a very clear and consistent pattern. First, homes take longer to sell when there's a gap between seller expectations and buyer behavior. Second, buyers often move quietly rather than rejecting a home directly. Third, the first impression and early momentum shape how the home is perceived moving forward. Fourth, pricing that feels slightly out of sync can create hesitation even when it seems reasonable. Fifth, condition signals, even small ones, can influence confidence and decision-making. Six, presentation, especially online, plays a major role in whether buyers engage at all. And now seventh, time on the market itself becomes part of the buyer's interpretation of the home. And when these factors are aligned, the process tends to feel smooth, consistent, and predictable. But when either one or two of these areas are slightly off, the effect can compound over time and create a slower experience. And what's important to recognize is that none of these factors exist in isolation. They are all connected. And that's why the solution is not to focus on just one element. It's to take a step back, look at how the home is being positioned as a whole. This is where I want to connect everything back to what this means to you if you're thinking about selling. Because the goal is to not walk away from this conversation feeling like something has gone wrong or the process is out of your control. the goal is to understand that the process is actually very predictable. When you know what to look for, when you start early, and when you give yourself 3 to 6 months before going to market. Because then you have the ability to evaluate all these factors in advance, to understand how your home compares to others in Alamo Heights and surrounding areas, to identify where alignment already exists and where small adjustments may be needed, and to build a strategy that supports a strong first impression instead of trying to correct course after the fact. And for sellers who may already be on the market, this is also an opportunity to step back, look at the process from a slightly different perspective, not asking whether something is wrong, but asking what the current signals are indicating and how the home might be repositioned to create more clarity for buyers. And in many cases, those adjustments are not dramatic. They're small, thoughtful refinements that bring the home back into alignment with how buyers are already thinking. And this is exactly how we approach the process with our clients. I'm Caroline Decherd with the Park Properties Group at the Phyllis Browning Company. Our focus is helping you understand how your home is being interpreted in today's market and how to position it in a way that creates the strongest possible response, whether that means preparing before you list or adjusting strategy while you're already on the market. And if you're thinking about selling in the next 3 to 6 months, or if you're currently on the market and you want a clear understanding of what you're seeing, the best next step is to start that conversation early. Review your home, your goals, your timeline in a way that allows you to move forward with clarity instead of uncertainty, because it's never too early to start planning. And when you approach the process with a clear strategy from the beginning, you reduce the likelihood of delays and create a much smoother, more confident path to the finish line. Again, I'm Caroline Decherd with the Park Properties Group at the Phyllis Browning Company. Thanks for watching.